Welcome, everyone. It's a great pleasure this afternoon to have Professor Gabrielle Thomas of Emory University in the Candler School of Theology. She's an expert on the Cappadocian Fathers, and that's what she's going to, an aspect of that is what she's speaking on. She covers all sorts of things. She teaches early Christianity and Anglican studies. She is very interested in ecumenism, as I am too, so that's a shared interest. But this afternoon, she's going to talk about Basil of Caesarea and Gregory of Nazianzus on the problem with the devil. So over to you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much, both for chairing, Professor Brock, and for inviting me, Dr. Larry. I really do appreciate it very much, and I'm very glad to be here. Just so you know, I'm not using a PowerPoint, but there's a handout going into the chat if anyone finds things like that useful. And I've just put translations and that kind of thing of the text in there for people to access at a later date, or my email if anyone has any questions that there aren't time to ask today or anything like that. So today's paper is more or less the first chapter, albeit it's obviously much shrunken and revised for this context, of the book that I'm currently writing on the problem of the devil in Cappadocian thought. And today's paper is setting up the context of how we begin to think about how do we approach the devil if we want to conduct a theological study of the devil. What kind of context are we going to place him in? And mostly what I'm doing today is teasing out where he has been studied and which lens he's been studied in, and why I think there are better ways than the one we're currently doing. So I will start anon, and there should be time for questions as well. In the words of Marilyn Robinson, if God is God, why does he permit evil and suffering and death? This question expresses the cry of innumerable hearts through the ages. Humans experiencing varied degrees of evil and suffering through which we struggle to make meaning. For many who profess faith in God, the psalmist's lament is all too relatable. My God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from helping me? From the words of my groaning. If God can help, why doesn't he? Does the good experienced in life outweigh the bad? And if not, how does God respond? And questions like these are gathered up in what is known as the classic problem of evil, which also came to be known as the problem of suffering. Simply put, the problem of evil constitutes the particular investigation of philosophers. They consider the correlation between the bad things that's happened in the world and the three believed attributes of God: omniscience, omnipotence, and omnibenevolence. Through the finely honed concerns of 18th century philosophers, sort of Bayle, Rousseau, Kant, Schopenhauer, to name a few, the problem of evil became one of the most debated questions amongst those involved in philosophical inquiry. The debates have shifted throughout subsequent centuries regarding which attributes are most important and which aspects of evil are most problematic. These debates emphasize different aspects of evil depending on the epistemological, ethical, or pastoral nature of the inquiry. Problems then demand a solution. At this point enters the devil. The devil, according to many modern commentators, is the early Christian, quote, strategy to solve the problem of evil. As Darren Aldridge puts it, he's written on the devil in the Oxford University Press series of very short introductions. Elsewhere, in the Routledge Philosophical Approaches to Demonology, David Carl Johnson argues, the inability to find an explanation for diseases and weather is that for which the demonic was invented. Adam Kotsko, in The Prince of This World, The Legacy and Life of the Devil, argues that at the heart of the story of the devil stands what is known as the problem of evil, which is proven to be the most durable challenge to monotheism. In his monograph, Satan and the Problem of Evil, From the Bible to the Early Church Fathers, Archie T. Wright asks, where does this Satan figure fit into the picture of good versus bad? And in a similar study, Ryan Stokes concludes that the devil was not always to blame for evil and suffering, but as the idea of a heavenly Satan figure is brought into conversation with different aspects of the problem of evil, this figure, little by little, received the blame for all that was wrong in the world. Certainly, the impression one is given is that early Christians blamed the devil for every kind of sin and suffering. Toward the end of the 20th century, in his influential monograph, Satan, the Early Christian Tradition, Jeffrey Burton Russell explains, the problem of evil is the theme of this book. Why is evil done to us, and why do we do evil ourselves? In order to gain a better understanding of the nature of evil, Russell investigates the history of the concept of the devil in well-known early Christian writings. Summarizing various theodicies and responses, he concludes by arguing that these problems lie at the heart of the concept of the devil. How the devil is conceived as the principal perpetrators of the activities named, however, remains undefined. The resulting milieu, at least intellectually, is one in which terms such as theodicy and concepts like the problem of evil have become the most common lens through which to examine the devil. Even when discussing contemporary liturgical theology, it's assumed that, quote, any discussion of the person and nature of the devil in relation to the broader concepts of evil and sin will likewise have theodicy at its heart. The devil, conceived thus, is little more than an early Christian solution to the problem of evil. Except that he's not the solution, at least not in the 4th century. This misconception, I think, stems from a grave misunderstanding of the breadth and complexity of early Christian thought. As we'll see today, Basil of Caesarea and Gregory of Nazianzus, our two interlocutors for today's paper, take seriously the task of responding to suffering, both theologically and pastorally. But for them, this is not the same task as theologically reflecting on the devil. So the paper proceeds in 3 distinct sections with the aim of disentangling the devil from the problem of evil as construed through modernity. The first section explores Gregory of Nazianzus' On His Father's Silence. This homily was crafted, as far as we can tell, in response to the suffering wrought by the famine in AD 368, during which an acute period of suffering ensued. While Gregory, of course, doesn't address what came to be called the problem of evil, this is a close example of him engaging theologically, exegetically, and pastorally with a wide-reaching and particular experience of suffering. The second section examines Basil's homily that it came to be known as That God is Not the Cause of Evil. This homily does exactly what the title says it does. Of all Basil's homilies that speak to problems of evil and suffering, this deals most directly with what evil is and how it exists in the world. Basil's keen to explore evil while emphasizing that the world was made by God and therefore good. While the exact dating of the homily is difficult to discern, scholars are agreed that Basil composed it mostly to respond to theological and practical issues emerging from the same famine. And then this brings us to the third and final section. With the devil hopefully now freed from the conceptual web of evil, we can begin to consider him on his own terms. And Hill will turn from homiletic to poetic form and investigate Gregory of Nazianzus' On Rational Natures. The poem not only enables us to diagnose why the devil presents a problem to our theologians, but provides, I propose, a more suitable lens through which to examine the devil going forward. I've limited the text that we're discussing today for obvious reasons of only having an hour, but there are many more that sort of go in this general direction. So we'll begin with Gregory of Nazianzus. According to Gregory of Nazianzus, the famine experienced during his ministry as bishop in Caesarea was the most severe in living memory. As Susan Holman comments, the famine of 368 must therefore be understood as a disaster, with consequences impacting society well beyond that date. The disparity between Cappadocia during good times and during the famine demanded a pastoral and theological and practical response from its bishops. And Gregory addresses some of these in a homily composed during his tenure as bishop. The sermon is commonly known as On His Father's Silence, because Gregory steps into the breach when his father has no words of hope to offer to the city. Gregory the Elder was overcome by the series of events of which the homily speaks: unusually cold weather, failed crops, and the lack of fruit from the vines. The culmination of the famine brought those near and far to the brink of starvation. Around the same time, Gregory of Nazianzus wrote to Thecla, a wealthy landowner. He asks her to send wine because he has none to share and wants to lift the morale of his people. While contemporary readers might be tempted to smirk at the thought of a bishop who is privileged in treating a wealthy woman to send him wine, it seems very clear that Gregory wanted to really raise the spirits of those around him because of the fact they'd experienced the hardest of hardships. Regarding his active response to the privation around him, he leads a social program of release necessary for the time of recovery after famine. And the homily we're about to explore aims not to provide only a vision of hope amongst those suffering, thus therefore caring for the soul, but also care of the body by encouraging the act of sharing resources. Gregory begins his homily by offering a choice between two possible accounts of the famine. Option A is that the people of Caesarea can conceive these disasters as happening simply by chance. Option B is that they reflect upon God's providence and understand the famine in light of this. Evidently, Gregory considers the second of his choices as the only way feasible to reflect on the famine, because he turns directly to the Old Testament to reflect on God's providence. So I'm not really convinced that he really thinks there's two options, but it was a nice move regardless. He then provides a model of how to interpret this suffering within the context of God's providence, grounding his reflection in the physical disasters that struck those living in Egypt. Through the disasters, Gregory proposes, God provides an opportunity for the reformation of lives through these events. Rather than simply advocating for all who are affected to endure the season, or exhorting them to use it as an opportunity to repent of disordered lives, Gregory then appeals to God's mercy. He encourages his people to confess their sins, but he also confesses his own, on the basis that an important remedy for evil is confession. He then encourages people to fast and pray. He intercedes on his people's behalf, reminding God that these people are Christ's own. Even so, we are your people, he says, your inheritance. And so correct us, but not in anger, in case you bring us to nothing, and make us a thing of contempt to those around us. Through the homily, Gregory offers a psalm-like lament, which results in a theological reflection on suffering, ultimately aiming to offer hope of salvation. Gregory first recognizes the suffering, allowing his audience to do the same. Then he moves through a process of lament and repentance. He concludes in the hope of bringing his people to a place of hope of God's restoration through Christ and in the fullness of time. Theologically speaking, Gregory's response to suffering takes place within the context of God's providence, but with an eschatological perspective on restoration. What was noteworthy to me when I first started searching through the vast corpus of the Cappadocians, Gregory doesn't mention the devil at all in this homily, but he mentions the devil a lot. The devil's absolutely scattered through his sermons, through his letters, through his theological treatises, and through his poems. But there's absolutely no mention to the devil either as the evil one, Satan, all of the various names that they give him. And if modern commentators are correct, and the devil is little more than an early Christian problem to the solution of evil, then there's something wrong with Gregory's sermon. Is there a devil responsible, or even partly responsible, or even present in the famine of AD 368? On the basis of this sermon, the obvious answer is no, he's not. Our pastor theologian doesn't blame the devil indirectly, a move he could have made very easily by harking back to the origins of evil and placing firmly on the devil the responsibility for all the sin in the world. And the devil's absence is noteworthy because, as Morwenna Ludlow, Dana Caleres, and many others have shown, the devil appears frequently in Gregory's work. On many occasions, the devil is at the forefront of Gregory's theological imagination, but he's not here. The devil is not the solution to the problem of evil. In fact, what's very clear is there is no solution at all in any proper sense of the word. So that's where the devil isn't. Where then is the devil in this wonderful web that we have? As we move on to the second section, I'm going to look at where the devil does show up. Where is he in an account of the origins of evil and suffering, and what is his role? And so with this in mind, we turn to Basil's "That God is not the cause of evil," a homily also crafted, at least this is what scholars are currently agreeing on, in response to the AD 368 famine. So we're talking around probably a slightly different time, but the same kind of circumstances. So Basil begins his response by reflecting on the Psalms. We learn that Scripture responds to suffering in many different ways. Sometimes David exhibits patient endurance. Basil takes that from Psalm 3. At other times, he praises God for responding swiftly to his complaint. Psalm 4. When a person is in sin, they should ask for God's mercy. Psalm 6. And on occasion, they should also remind God that they're suffering when it seems as though God might have forgotten them. Psalm 21. So Basil clearly sets up the idea that there is no one right way to respond to suffering. This isn't a box where we can sort of say one size fits all. Basil's first theological move is to ground his homily, as Gregory did, in God's providence, and to observe that God is attentive to the things in the world. The gravest mistake, Basil claims, that we can make is to believe that bad things happen because there's no God. Indeed, it is as serious to claim that there's no God as it is, as far as Basil's concerned, to claim that God is the cause of all evils. The first sin denies God, and the second denies God's goodness. A result of having turned from God, Basil contends, is to claim that God is the cause of all evils. And by evils, Basil says that he has in mind things such as diseases, pestilences, and untimely deaths. Having introduced his audience to the sermon's theme, Basil explains that those who pay attention will learn to discern the difference between what our senses perceive as evil and what is evil by its own nature. Evils that are perceived comprise things, as far as Basil is concerned, experiences such as bodily illness, lack of necessities, disgrace, financial setbacks, and loss of property, many of which would have been experienced due through the process of the famine. Basil doesn't consider these experiences as evil by nature, since, he argues, they are brought to us by the wise and good master for our advantage. He provides an example of this kind of evil, that illness is an advantage to those who would be likely to sin if their limbs remained unconstrained. It's worth noting that Basil's move probably would not land well with many of us today. According to Basil's Theology of Providence, God justly sends famines, droughts, and floods to those cities and nations indulging in excesses of evil. This argument is consistent with Basil's approach to suffering in the homily discussed above, as with Gregory. Basil doesn't mention or even blame the devil during his explanation of what our senses perceive as evil, but affirms that the responsibility for perceived evil lies with human sin. He says, "For the beginning and root of sin is in us and our self-determination." And for those who are interested in Greek, he's using autexousios there. After commenting on what our senses perceive as evil, Basil then goes on to introduce evil in its own nature. The second kind of evil defiles the soul, he says, that has come into being according to the image of its creator. And before exploring Basil's instruction on evil by nature, it's worth pausing to comment on the Greek, because it's a very tricky phrase and could be taken in a number of ways. So Lamp's Greek patristic lexicon on the English translation of nature, physis, has several pages. I think it's about 7. And so there's an awful lot of ways that you can end up taking this. Nature could mean origin and creation, or it can also mean kind and sort. And Basil affirms many, many times that evil is without origin and it's not created. So it would be completely incongruous for him when speaking of evil by nature to mean evil as it exists at creation. So I don't think that's what he's saying, but I think it's just worth noting that because it could get a little bit confusing if it's not carefully translated. On the contrary, evil by nature, he says, has been notably introduced by humankind. So evil by nature includes injustice, licentiousness, folly, cowardice, envy, murder, poisoning, I was fascinated by that one, laziness, and passions akin to these. So I think he means evil by nature, meaning the kind of evil. That's what he's talking about there. So having determined how one recognizes between these two kinds of evil, Basil then asks, from what source then does evil exist, if it's neither without origin nor created? His first response, as we would expect from a theologian who writes against Manichaean thought, is to state that evil was not created with the good. Drawing on the first 3 chapters of Genesis, Basil reflects upon creation and Adam's expulsion from paradise. Enjoying the delights of paradise, Adam is given authority akin to that of the angels, Basil tells us. And even greater than this, he is able to hear the divine voice. One might expect Basil to introduce the devil disguised as the serpent, given that as far as Basil and the rest of them are concerned, in the 4th century, the serpent in the Garden of Eden is absolutely the devil. However, Basil doesn't mention the serpent's interaction with Eve in the Garden of Eden, despite the fact that he spends time reflecting on the first 3 chapters of Genesis. Instead, Basil places the responsibility for sin's entrance into the world very firmly on Adam. He explains Adam's expulsion from Eden in the following way. He says, becoming insolent through satiety, he, Adam, preferred what appeared delightful to fleshly eyes, to the spiritual beauty, and considered the filling of the stomach more valuable than the spiritual enjoyments. Evil then enters the world, not through the devil, but through Adam's thoughtlessness. Basil reaches the third section of his homily and asks, at last, his first series of questions about the devil. But what also comes to mind, he says, following our sequence of thought, is the question of the devil. From where does the devil come if evils are not from God? What then shall we say? The devil is evil for the same reason that humankind is evil. Namely, he's endowed with self-determination. And to make his point, Basil compares Gabriel with Satan. The first angel chose to use the gift of self-determination wisely, whereas the latter chose to withdraw from God. Basil inquires no further into the quandary of why Satan chose wrongly and by why Gabriel chose well. He does, however, clarify that God is not to blame for Satan's choice. The devil is wicked because he possesses wickedness by free choice. And there, for those of you interested in the Greek, it's prohairesis, not through a natural opposition to the good. Modern readers might wonder further over the logic of Satan's choice, since it seems somewhat strange for a leading angel who dwelt in the near presence of God to choose something else. But Basil doesn't investigate this particular conundrum. Instead, he moves on swiftly and tackles the problem of the devil, who now wars against human beings. The devil, already being a receptacle of all evils, envied humankind's ease in paradise, and he became an enemy through trickery. Since human beings are made according to the image of God, Basil tells us this fuels the devil's hatred on two counts. Humans belong to God, doesn't like that, and humans are like God. The devil hates humankind because he hates God, and therefore is an enemy of both. Thus, Basil identifies the devil as the problem that human beings cannot ignore, approaching the task of instructing on the devil as that which is distinct from his earlier discussions of perceived evil and evil by nature. He draws on Genesis 3:15 to explain that God put enmity between the serpent and humankind to protect the latter. Since this enmity is irreconcilable, God's plans for human beings to wrestle with the devil, who is now here and was stuck with, through obedience. While distinguishing the devil from other forms of evil and suffering, Basil treats doctrinally the problem of the devil in the same way that he treated the problem of evil by nature, by locating the human problem with the devil in the theological context of God's providence. Having established the devil as the principal enemy of human beings, Basil interrogates certain names by which the devil is known. This helps believers identify who he is and how he's been at work through salvation history. Hitherto, Basil's spoken of Satan and devil. Next, we meet enemy and adversary. The devil, Basil teaches, is called enemy because he's enemy of both God and God's likenesses. That's human beings. He's called adversary because God has planned for us to wrestle with the devil now that both are fallen. Basil then enters into his second series of questions about the devil, concluding with the devil's name. Who was the devil? What was his rank? What was his dignity? And why, in short, has he been named Satan? Basil piles question upon question, each of which points to the difficulties and challenges with the devil. Basil's response begins with an explanation of the devil's proper name, which points to his primary identity as an opponent of the good. He is Satan, therefore, because he stands opposite to the good. For this is what the Hebrew word means, as we have learned in the book of Kings. For it says, the Lord raised up an adversary against Solomon. And he's referring to 1 Kings 11. And Basil continues, and since he is the devil, since he himself both collaborates in our sin and becomes our accuser. He rejoices in our destruction while he makes an example of us for the things that we've done. And then turning to Ephesians, Basil notes that the devil's nature is bodiless, which we learn from the apostle, he says, Our wrestling is not with flesh and blood, but with the spirits of wickedness. And his honour is that of a ruler. The devil's place of rule is in the air, and he's also called the ruler of the world, since his rule surrounds the earth. And he's accompanied by an army that is quick to do his bidding. Basil closes his tour de force of the devil's names by discussing the serpent. The devil appears in the form of the serpent in the 3rd chapter of Genesis, and as such, he's the deceiver of humankind. Basil doesn't stop there. He notes that Christ's followers have been given the authority to resist the devil and trample on serpents, like the first disciples. In his survey of devil, Satan, enemy, adversary, ruler of the air, ruler of the world, and serpent, Basil moves deftly through the biblical names for Satan, highlighting how he's a problem for the people of God. When Basil recalls the devil's identity as the serpent in the Garden of Eden, his audience is reminded that the devil acts primarily through deception. Thus, they need to be on their guard against his wiles. Christ has given them the authority to resist, but if they succumb to the devil's deceptions, fixing their eyes on things other than the good, the devil is quick to assume the role of their accuser. In this sense, the devil poses a problem that is both existential and practical. Existential in the sense that he persists after being defeated by Christ, to which Basil responds by locating the devil's continuing presence in the theological context of God's providence, and practical in the sense that the devil wars against humankind through deceptive schemes, to which Basil responds by making him known. And I should say, in terms of the Cappadocian fathers, both Gregory of Nyssa and Gregory of Nazianzus have their own way of dealing with this ongoing problem and of the presence of the devil after Christ's defeat of him. The three of them, they all handle it slightly differently. So we can pause before the final section. My first step was to disentangle the devil from the problem of evil. If Basil of Caesarea and Gregory of Nazianzus believe that the devil's to blame for the evil in the world, one might expect to encounter him in the homiletic responses to the catastrophic famine of AD 368. But we didn't. Moreover, if they understand the devil as the explanation for evil and suffering, we might expect him to be noted as the purpose of the fall of humankind. But as we journeyed through with Basil, we didn't meet the devil until the very last section of his homily, in a distinct third sort of section on his own. Here, Basil treats the devil as a third kind of evil, distinct from what we might perceive as evil and evil by nature. The devil is not responsible for sin's entrance into the world. Adam is, at least in this account. With the devil hopefully disentangled from the conceptual web of the problem of evil, we can begin to consider him on his own terms. For this purpose, I'm going to turn from homilies to poetry and explore Gregory of Nazianzus' poem on rational natures. The poem not only enables us to diagnose, I think, what is the biggest problem with the devil, but also provides a more suitable lens than theodicy to examine him if we want to set up a theological study. Gregory's account is at what is at the heart of the problem of the devil, and it appears in his Arcana, which is a collection of poetry in which Gregory explores themes and doctrines such as first principles, Christology, pneumatology, the cosmos, providence, and the soul. And if we bear in mind that he tells us he composed poems for didactic purposes, we can assume that exposing the devil's wiles belonged to this task of teaching. So let us turn then to the poem entitled On Rational Natures. Angelic brilliance is this poem's theme. Therefore, it's not surprising that Gregory begins by extolling the greatness of angels. Matters such as angels are beyond his comprehension. But, Gregory assures his readers, the Spirit has taught him what he knows. So they're both beyond his comprehension, but he's going to now attempt to give us a jolly good exposition of them. In claiming knowledge in this way, Gregory situates himself within a Christian tradition of a Jewish esotericism that existed at the time of the apostles, in which certain Christians were given visions and insights into the mysteries of heaven. Angels, he tells us, are second lights, servants to the first light, God. After a brief description of the gloriousness of angels, Gregory addresses the theme of angelic self-determination. God is reluctant to propose that such a species of Gregory is reluctant to propose that such a species as angels who are filled with light might sin. And his reasoning for the fact that it's a possibility is the devil. Like Basil, Gregory is quick to note that God cannot be blamed for Lucifer's sin. Despite being honoured by God, Lucifer hoped for honour equal to God's. This misdirected desire is not met, and he plummets from heaven, dishonoured, becoming total darkness. And having left the heavenly realms, this creature now roams the earth. And Gregory tells us that he has no wish that the beings fashioned by God, humans obviously, should approach the place from which he fell. As Gregory tells it, the fallen angel hates human beings because we're heaven-bound. This hatred prompts all kinds of deceptions and temptations. God, in his mercy, doesn't abandon humans to the devil's plans of destruction, however. Christ defeats the devil. But while certain of Christ's victory, Gregory is uncertain about why the devil continues to be rampant on the earth. As I discussed a moment ago, Basil responds to this conundrum by arguing that humans are joined in battle against the devil's wickedness through God's wisdom and foreknowledge. The battle serves as a training exercise for the soul. Gregory, however, is not so sure. He puzzles over why Christ would permit the high impostors, which is the devil and his minions, to continue to wreak havoc. For Gregory, the devil's presence is difficult to reconcile because Christ could have got rid of him completely if he'd wanted to do that. And he says, had he willed it, Christ could have annihilated Lucifer immediately, for it's hard to escape the anger of God. Yet it is not that he left my enemy in total freedom. Rather, he dismissed Lucifer to a midpoint between good and evil. He provoked a dreadful struggle between Lucifer and humanity that he might incur further awful shame, inasmuch as he was warring against a weaker opponent, whereas his human adversaries, striving through the exercise of goodness, might gain their everlasting glory. Perhaps also might Lucifer, for all his stubborn resistance, hereafter pay his penalty, his substance consumed, when there is requital by fire, though indeed he was to a great degree subdued therefore in the persons of his harried minions. Reflecting on why Christ did not annihilate the devil and his minions, Gregory gives two perspectives, diabolic and human. From the diabolic perspective, he imagines that it's shameful to war against a weak opponent such as the human. Thus, the devil's continued existence serves as a punishment for his own sin. Exploring how humans might benefit from the devil's continuing presence on the earth, Gregory aims to shine an eschatological light on the problem by proposing that if we strive against the devil, the activity might win us everlasting glory. Gregory's proposal regarding the human perspective is much like Basil's, but for one word, perhaps. Our theologian's final word on the devil's persistence is one of uncertainty. This lack of clarity about the devil's continuing presence is congruent with Gregory's lament in a narration composed a little after the famine. Gregory grieves over the apparent freedom of the devil. He says, would the evil be destroyed utterly, both the first seed of evil and the evil one, who sowed seeds in us while we were sleeping. The devil is of little benefit to our theologian as an explanation for evil and suffering. As a fallen angel who hates humankind, he poses, I think, more problems than he solves. And now we have reached the crux of the problem with the devil, at least as Gregory tells it. The devil is an angel, and a fallen one at that. The devil's angelic identity may pose many problems for Gregory. For us, however, I think it provides a viable context from which to launch a study of the devil, much more viable than theodicy. So to conclude, having dipped our toes into the murky waters of evil and suffering, it's important to be clear about what the paper is not arguing. In attempting to disentangle the devil from the conceptual web that constitutes the problem of evil, I'm not proposing that Gregory and Basil believe the devil has nothing to do with evil's origins and human sin. The devil is intimately connected with all phases of salvation history, from its beginning to its end. However, I've aimed to show that for Basil and Gregory, the devil didn't serve as a straightforward explanation for evil and suffering in the world. To claim the devil as their solution to the problem of evil would be to gravely undermine and misconceive their theological, pastoral, and practical engagement with suffering. Read together, the sources draw attention to problems of evil and suffering and the devil in a way so that we can distinguish between the three. Having broadly surveyed the problem of evil and noted how the devil is entangled in it, I proceeded to disentangle him so that we can begin to think about the devil on his own terms. And to this end, my first aim was to read closely Gregory of Nazianzus on his father's silence. This exhibited creative engagement with the Old Testament as its author theologically and pastorally responds to the suffering wrought through the famine, and we saw that the devil was absent from that scene. Then we looked at that God is not the cause of evil. And in this homily, Basil tackles directly how the problem of evil exists in a world made by a God who is good. Notably, the devil is absent from the sections in which Basil explains between evil as we perceive it and evil by nature. The devil enters rather gloriously in the final section of the homily, in which Basil addresses all the kinds of problems raised by the enemy. He continues to war against humankind, and a problem which Basil resolves by locating the devil in the theological context of God's providence. And the devil plays a major role because of the fact that the devil plays a major role in deceiving thoughtless humans. He rejoices when he has the opportunity to stand as their accuser. Basil's didactic response to the devil's continued activity is to instruct at length on the devil's names. He wants to make him known to his audience. And by doing this, he tells us that the devil is a tempter, a deceiver, and an accuser. And he rallies his audience to stand firm against him. And then lastly, we explored Gregory of Nazianzus on rational natures. In diagnosing what's at heart of the problem of the devil, I think we find a way to consider him on his own terms. He's an angel, and our theologians drew on to traditions of interpretations that understood Scripture as speaking of one adversary, Satan, Lucifer, serpent, and devil, who moves across testaments old and new. The devil is not, as he has been assumed by modern commentators, a personification of evil, or a goblin, or a fairy, or an elf, but a rational being attempting to oppose divine will. So put simply, I don't think that the devil is the Cappadocian solution to the problem of evil. I think their problem is with the devil himself. As such, they must deal with him, and then teach the church to do likewise. At times, he creates a philosophical and theological problem too, because they need to explain his fall, his presence on the earth, and his ultimate end, which they each take different approaches to. Taking seriously, though, the devil's angelic identity affords us the theological context in which to pursue questions concerning his will, his agency, his embodiment, and the relationship between the divine, human, and diabolic actors in the drama of salvation. So angelology, then, is the lens through which I propose we examine the devil, which, of course, yet raises further problems of its own. Thank you.
Thank you so much. This is a wonderfully clear exposition of the problem. Now, if I could boldly ask a question to start off with, in my experience dealing with patristic texts, you want to have problems always have a biblical basis. Now, an obvious one for a fallen angel is the Enochic account of Genesis 6. Now, Genesis 6 and what started off as fall of angels, by the time of the 4th century, it had changed. It's the fall of the Sethites, who come down from paradise and corrupted by people on earth. But does Gregory or Basil mention Genesis 6:2 in this period, in this discussion?
So Gregory mentions it once in one of his poems, not with any sort of it's almost like a passing comment as opposed to something that he then genuinely digs into and pulls apart and that kind of thing, but not with any real. It's almost like he doesn't really expect you to interrogate it. He seems perfectly happy with all sorts of different sort of comments, ideas and solutions, and there's absolutely no point in which one could say he's setting up any kind of systematic account of who the devil is, not by a long shot. It's not always, it doesn't always fit. Once you take everything, you couldn't possibly say he's doing this, but yes, but only once and not a lot. Yeah. Although I do think you can see a lot of the strands of Enoch in there, well, certainly with Gregory in his thinking, but because he doesn't quote it, it's hard to sort of, I can't necessarily come down and say, yes, it's definitely this, but my instinct is that's really what he's absorbing. Yeah.
Good, thank you very much. Now we're open to questions. We've got a bit of time, so please either use the put your hand up or use it in the chat.
I think I saw one in the chat.
Oh, good.
About Job. Yes. Do your sources reflect to or react to the book of Job? Only in the sense that Satan, in that, yes, they do, but in terms of when they're really thinking about Job, it's usually as Job as a righteous example. And then when they're thinking about Satan in Job, they're very much drawing out his role as the accuser. But they don't tend to think of that as a good thing. And obviously at the time, Satan was part of God's court, but they tend to have sort of reinterpreted it as he accuses, but not in a good way. As in, like, yeah, he's not doing it sort of with and for God's blessing in that sense.
Alas, time has run out. So thank you very much. That was a marvelous talk and challenging to everyone, challenging questions. And so we're most grateful to you. Now,
thank you.
April, we don't have a meeting because of the various festivals, Passover, Pascha, Easter. But in May, is there a fixed date for May?
Yes, 19th of May. We have
19th of May.
Andrew on Narsai. He will speak. I will email everyone, but we will have him Narsai. He will present his book, recently published book on Narsai.
Wonderful. So put that in your diaries, put it in mind, and till then, goodbye and thank you again so much. Wonderful talk.
Thank you so much to people for coming and for inviting me. Thank you.